Greetings and welcome back to another discussion. Today, I'm quite pleased to be able to bring you a rather unique individual. This person is a person from China and is also a female originally, has spent a fair bit of time in the West. And primarily, what we're going to be talking about are the cultural differences, societal differences between the West and China when it comes to mating, dating, reproduction, this sort of thing. Because I think, if anything, by the end of this talk, you'll realize that the differences are quite profound, and we might learn something in the process. So, thank you for joining me, Jojo. Um,
Yeah,
before
thank you
we,
for having me.
My pleasure. Before we launch into it, I guess where I kind of wanted to start was with the so-called Cultural Revolution, and I'm going to butcher his name since I'm not Chinese by Mao Zedong. I don't know how you say it, but this important period in modern Chinese history between 1966 and 1976 where a lot of things happen. But here in the West, at least, from the little information we can glean from it, the idea is that Mao really wanted to change things up. He wanted to change the direction of Chinese society, and what his intention was to get rid of so-called capitalism, but also a lot of the traditional stuff that used to be around, historically, culturally. Now, that might be a misunderstanding on my part. I'm hardly an expert on Chinese history, but conventionally speaking, in the West, that's what we that's the received wisdom. That's really what the Cultural Revolution was about, to sort of eliminate any trace of capitalism and to get rid of these old, used up cultural artifacts in Chinese society. But as you are a person from the Middle Kingdom and much more in tune with this, I'm sure you can tell us a little bit more about that. So, in your in your opinion, perspective, what do you think the Cultural Revolution was, and what do you think its impact was on Chinese society?
And actually, I think that's a very interesting question because if you know, the Cultural Revolution has been like any information about it has been largely censored in China.
Hmm.
So growing up, we only had like one chapter in our history book that talked about Cultural Revolution, and you don't get a lot of information about it, and people tend to not talk about it. There may be private communications, but it's really rare that you hear more about on this topic. So, um, growing up, I had a lot of questions around this as well because you get the idea like people were quite crazy about Chairman Mao and like worship him as if he was God, and you hear all these stories about people turning against each other during the Cultural Revolution, even within families, and just a lot of tragedy that happened. And so I've always wondered what got people so crazy and why is everybody playing victim? Uh, and it's very strange. And when I looked back in like 2016, when they had the 50th anniversary of the Cultural Revolution, and if you look at the news reports on the so-called anniversary journalism on this topic, you can see that within mainland China, there are probably just one or two media that talked about it, and it sorry got some attention like in Hong Kong, there was a huge discussion about it, and you can also see the reports coming out from UK, US. And if you look at the content, the mainland Chinese media basically talking about how it was a huge mistake and we should just turn the page and look forward and focus on growth and the future. Whereas in Hong Kong, uh, there were still some like fractions
Mhm.
people are have very divided opinions on this topic. Some are even like feeling nostalgic about the uh, historical period. And in
If
the
I may,
U.S.,
nostalgic in what way? As in they they think it was good or they think it was bad or
They think it was good. They wanted to come back. That was from the media report. But like I would say in mainland China itself, like people also have like very divided opinion or many different kinds of stories around this historical period. Because it's it has a huge impact, and the stories that we've heard is it's just really hard to get a whole picture of what is going on, right? So like after the Cultural Revolution, Deng Xiaoping had this like meeting when they had this decision to fully declare the whole thing was a mistake. But how come you just like defined a historical period like as a mistake and not talk about it? What has happened? So it's quite blur. And I don't think as of now Chinese people got the truth or the whole picture or the stories that they deserve, and the reconciliation maybe, or just like simply learning what has happened. Like we haven't done that. It has, and it's very complicated because like everyone might have their individual memory about it. People grow up like after that period of time, they can hear some stories from their parents, grandparents, but it's very hard to piece the information together because it's like largely censored.
mm,
So that made it very complicated. And I sort of understand. Uh, I was saying, like, for example, the US and UK during that time, the reports come out, they are very like playing the historian and trying to jot down like a what has happened, getting the witness accounts or whatnot. But it's mm, I don't think that's enough, and I don't know when would that time come that we can, have an open discussion about this stuff. I hope so. Like one day, maybe it will happen. But to be honest, it hasn't been very promising, like
mm,
the prospects of us having a conversation, especially when you look at 2018. There was a report coming out that the Chinese Communist Party actually changed the history textbook, the chapter when they talk about Cultural Revolution. First of all, it deleted it as one uh, like a standalone chapter. It combined it to some other uh, part, and then they rewrote it from like Mao Zedong mistakenly think that the Chinese Communist Party need to have the revisionist and they just like deleted word mistakenly, and they deleted like the Communist Party push for like revisionist, and they added one sentence saying that there's never smooth sailed in in like history, like the world history is always tumbling through in all these ups and downs. And it's just like a really interesting changing
well,
the narrative.
if I may make a few points. So I think if you're a young person, neither you nor I are super, well, I'm definitely not young, super young, but I think that if you're a young person, the 60s and the 70s is a long time ago, right? I mean, relatively speaking. And I think in the case of China, again, I'm hardly an expert on China, but what you get is a confluence, a joining of younger and younger generations who are experiencing a very different form of China. And by that I mean the influx of wealth and capital. I think these are my own experiences with, say, Chinese exchange students at universities or people I've worked with in the past, that there's been a disinterest in this period in general, in part because modern Chinese people, mostly younger people, obviously, are enjoying an unprecedented level of wealth and luxury that they never have before. So they can buy things, they have levels of comfort, they can afford to go to universities, expensive universities in the West. And I think when you have a certain level of comfort and wealth, that tends to obscure interest and really even I would somewhat dilutes interest in historical events. I mean, maybe for example, the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward, they were just terrible things. Maybe who knows? But what does it matter, right? Because in 2021 or whenever you're asking the person in recent years, China has a lot of money and there's an increasingly wealthy sector of Chinese society, so why bother? Basically, we're doing well, so why think about it? I think people become much more interested in history and historical trajectories when they're not doing well, when they don't have enough money, when they have to worry about their finances, when they have to worry about starving to death, right? When things are okay, people are just a lot less concerned. There's a lot less hostility between people because everyone has enough to eat. And more importantly, they don't have just enough to eat, they have enough to buy luxury goods. I think that's an important factor in this. This is my own 2 cents as a
And
non-Chinese person. Maybe I'm wrong about that.
I tend to disagree though.
Okay.
I don't think there's direct relation between um the welfare of the people and their need to reflect on the history. I think history does offer all of us, whether we were doing well or not, valuable lessons to be learned. It may not be help us to predict future, but like how to navigate. And in terms of when people are poor and like think about, where's my next meal, maybe people even have less time to think about the historical lessons. And when people are more well off, um, yeah, people might tend to forget. So
Well,
I'm don't see exactly the relations
okay.
there,
Let me
but
revise my statement because I think maybe there's a misinterpretation. I'm also old and tired, so I'm not saying that people who are poor are hyper focused on history. It's just that things appear to be more impactful. They're much more likely to observe the effects of policies and think about them if they're being harmed by them or if they think that there's harm coming to them. Which is not to say, yeah, that's what I basically meant. Not to
uh,
say that,
I
yeah.
will I will agree with you in the sense that in China, since we're framing it in this context, like this is my personal experience as well, or like the personal struggle I went through, because I will also think, okay, now we have things and the country was developing, and do we still need to look at those like tragical period in Chinese like contemporary history and you know and open wounds, because they are a lot of like sad tragic stories, and you can sense like mm, it can be very traumatic if you openly talk about it. But the more I think about it, I tend to think that we should do it, because from the CCP's perspective, I understand why they don't want to talk about it. Like my simple interpretation is that because it's one party, right? And it's if they say it's directed by Mao or not, but it's the symbol of it is like Mao made a mistake, and then people a lot we had this very tragical period. So if they start talking about how mistaken that was and how much horrible stuff it has been done during that period, it's mm, there's a lot of debts that need to be cleaned. There's people that was supposed to be more like responsible that need to be,
Well, it undermines
maybe
authority. If you,
exactly.
yeah,
So it's like basically, in order for CCP to keep its legitimacy of the ruling, they cannot. They try to erase the history. Basically, the same logic goes to the Great Lip, the Great Famine, and the June 4th.
yeah.
That's my understanding. Like I understand, like because it's like one party ruling. If you start cleaning debts, a lot of people will be responsible, and that's why they are trying to erase the history, erase the memory, and not talk about it, and just focus on growth. But when I look at what has been happening around me, and I feel the more I look about it, like I was see, like my mom's generation, probably they grew up in the Cultural Revolution. Like to this day, those people they still frequently quote churn them out all the time, like because that's how they were brought up. They memorized the sentences from this like little red book, and they just repeat it. It's like really like imprinted in their minds. And how I look at the mm, how people interact with each other, and I feel like, with all this turmoil back in the days, like now Chinese people do have this mentality that they fear uh instability, they fear chaos.
Hmm.
So, to some extent, I think CCP capitalized on that. And let's just have one party rule and focus on stability and harmonious society, and not talk about anything else. And also, like when I think about how just like how an individual interact with each other, that kind of lack of trust, to some extent, I think it can attribute to what happened during Cultural Revolution as well. Because those people who um had a living experience of that, they're in their like 50s, 60s, 70s, and it's still, I believe it can still be quite fresh,
Yeah.
you know and so I tend to think Cultural Revolution left a very profound impact on Chinese people's life. But for people like me who grew up like later and had no living memory of that period, it's almost like a puzzle.
Hmm.
And that's why I just like do not understand, like, if it has such a strong impact. And I tend to think that, yeah, it's tragic, but it's certainly not true that everyone was a victim. And even if everyone is a victim, what has gone wrong? What happened? And if we are to erase the memory, how can we have a conversation? And if we don't have the conversation, how can we expect to learn the lessons from um, this history? And you are asking me from sorry for the dichotomy, but like a Western perspective, right? So like there's this saying that Cultural Revolution happened in China, but the studies of Cultural Revolution happened in the West.
Hmm.
So like I know that like you probably like living in the West can have access to more information on Cultural Revolution than I do in China, because there are like books written like by the Chinese historian like in Stanford,
Well,
and I know that.
case in point,
Mm,
Jojo, if you go to Wikipedia, there's nothing in Chinese about it. There's nothing.
I think there is though. There is
I,
probably in like
well,
traditional Chinese. Yeah, there
I
is one.
or maybe I tried to look for something and I couldn't find anything.
Yeah,
Um,
I think there is. I think there is.
okay, fair
At
enough.
least in traditional Chinese, there is. Yeah,
Okay,
but
well,
like,
yeah, I couldn't.
yeah, but like, like there's I know there's a huge archive in Stanford University. There's actually a huge archive in Lund University in Sweden, because they had a Swedish historian focusing on the Cultural Revolution. And even like Dutch, one that the famous historian, he's Dutch, like he's now teaching at University of Hong Kong, I believe. And even like in Germany, there are like a scholar studying uh, uh, in University of Cologne, I think, like studying like Maoist China, and
Well, I
recently
mean,
launched like.
basically, what you're saying is that if you want to get information on the Cultural Revolution, the people who've invested the most time and energy studying and examining it are largely Westerners, because
I
it's
wouldn't
no.
I wouldn't like within China they are people studying this for sure, but it's just like the information are not made public available. The books they publish about the topic, they're censored. They can publish in Hong Kong, right? Uh, and the TV shows made about it, uh, there's like no TV shows, movies that directly address that period of time. Even if there is, they're censored. And it's just, yeah. And if you talk about it, like usually you have to larger frame it in like the official public discourse. So so difference between how individual remembers it and what the public discourse is. And I think that without the public discussion and debate, or like if we can talk, without being able to talk about it openly, it is really hard for us to get a picture of what when what was going on.
So it's basically
And
impossible to have make any generalization on the impact of the Cultural Revolution on modern Chinese society. To say, look, this happened, this led to this. You couldn't really uh, describe a causal chain, so to speak.
no, no. And even this like thing about Mao is also kind of interesting because for example, I recently watched Adam Curtis's documentary, and he touched on the Cultural Revolution, and he talked about how like Jiang Qing, Mao's wife, what her role in the Cultural Revolution, which to some extent I think might be more closer to the truth. But it is also interesting to see how Western people like understand the movement. Yeah,
Mm.
but I guess all this I've said is just also an excuse for me, like what I don't know more about this. I sometimes, yeah, do blame myself. And to the point that you were making about how people tend to forget and tend not to focus on it. This is also my fear, because um, you do witness a bunch of young Chinese people growing up, especially born in the late 90s or even 2000s. Uh, uh, are you aware of this like group of people called Little Pink?
I've heard a little bit about it, but I don't know
Yeah.
enough about. Yeah, maybe you explain
So
for the
this
audience. Yeah.
so there's like a group of young Chinese people, some of them very educated and some even like foreign educated, and they become very patriotic towards China, or even very nationalistic, and try to defend China and like even CCP's policies. And so there's this group of people dubbed like Little Pink. And in the beginning, when I heard about this group of people, I was like, how how can this be? Like, if you are educated, especially if you go overseas and if you had access to more information, how can you have this kind of ideas? But if you think about it, like, you know, um, this group of people might actually like they grew up in China during a time that Chinese economy was developing very rapidly, and they've enjoyed all this like benefits and wealth that's like you know um in their living environment. And
Hmm.
then all the news that they've heard is how great CCP is, how great China is. So when they and also a point is like they grew up in the time when there's already like more enhanced censorship. So there's a huge contrast from their previous generation, grew up in the 80s, 90s, when there was no firewall, the Great Firewall of China yet. That was launched around 2008. So like so the Chinese youth grow up in the like now they're middle-aged people like grow up in the 80s and 90s. They actually experienced a short period of time growing up with the internet when it was still transparent and dynamic, and you have this like very vibrant conversation and not much hierarchy within the internet space. But around 2008, the Chinese government launched the Great Firewall, right? So like a lot of content was censored. So for the youth that grew up in the uh, n- uh 90s and later, they take not being able to access like Facebook, Instagram, that kind of things as a norm.
Hmm.
That's how they grow up. And so I think to some extent I can understand why they can become very defensive of the system, because that's what they believe that's great. And especially if they go overseas and with this increasing negative viewpoints on China, on this like China bashing narrative, I think it's understandable they can become very defensive and even pushed towards being, more patriotic. So, like now I come to understand them more, but at the same time, I do see the danger.
Mm.
in this, because it's almost like reactionary as well. And first of all, they didn't have that kind of access to like information when they were in China. All they
Well,
heard about is how great China is, and like
I
when they go out, they got, you know, they get defensive.
if I
I can
may,
understand that. Hmm.
I mean, these are just anecdotes, but there have been incidents where somebody in the West affiliated with a certain product, I think it was Apple in one case, Apple, the computer product that women love particularly, uh, they something was said or done that was sort of offensive to China or Chinese people, and so you'd have these instances of Chinese people within China catching wind of this and then destroying the products, only for a few weeks later to buy them again because there's a sort of one way, my perception at least, there's this one way filter of how these things work. And as you pointed out, the lack of transparency, it, and I mean, to my point earlier, exactly, but also if you're doing well, there's a lot of wealth, you have less reason to question, arguably, right? If if you're doing really well to the point where you can afford an expensive foreign university in Australia or the UK or the United States or Canada, that is an indication that, why would you question things to begin with? I mean, I'm not at all denying the points you're making. I think they're extremely valid, probably more valid than the points I'm making. After all, I'm not a person of the Middle Kingdom, but I think in general, if you're doing well, you have you're going to be not say less reflective, but you're just going to think, well, the status quo is fine. So,
I do believe a group of people like that exist for
mm,
sure, but I actually don't think they do not care. I've heard stories about how overseas Chinese students, when they come out, right, when they are on the other side of the Great Firewall, they start, watching documentaries on YouTube and Googling around what happened around June 4th, the Cultural Revolution, and whatnot, and come to know more about it. Um, the particular thing to do with like little pink or like just if we don't label them, but like, some they come out, they do well, and I think they do care, like in terms of their identity, their ideology, and to which extent do they identify as a Chinese person, and how you make a differentiation between being Chinese and being a person that's governed by the CCP. Like I am from China, but there's difference between the Chinese government and Chinese people.
mm,
And my fear is that some people might not I mean the Chinese overseas student, like talking from my even my personal experience, like I had to think hard and long on this topic in order to, you know I don't think I've reached a conclusion yet, but it's a journey for myself. um how people will have this sentiment against China. So when the Westerner people are talking about it, some of them will try to make the dis, di- try to distinguish. They're talking about the Chinese government. They're talking about what CCP is doing. CCP is doing. They're not targeting the Chinese people. But like I had some doubt around that. When some people make that claim, because when they say China's doing that, China's doing this, Mm, I'm not exactly sure if they can really make you know, the distinguish
well,
the
I mean, but
two.
this is
And then
this is not unique to China. I mean,
true.
during the many American escapades in the Middle East and North Africa, I mean, when people talk about America doing X, I mean, technically they are referring to the government, but they're talking about the Americans doing it. And so I think that's very normal in that sort of
And
rhetoric. This sort
and
of,
that kind of sentiment can also, if you I to be honest, I just think like some people would not be able to draw the difference. Like you talk about China, 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 and then at the end of the day, you look at the Chinese people, you instinctively will feel a little bit. if not hostile, at least defensive. So that happens. That's a fact. And then on the other hand, like on the other side, like for the Chinese people, I think it is also a journey to go through in the sense that you have to also learn I am a Chinese, but to which extent I identify as a Chinese. Like I speak the language, I grow up in that kind of environment, but what is good, what is bad, and especially when you grow up, you know, like when we were growing up in China, we have the flag raising ceremony every Monday to sing the national anthem, to see the rising flag, and then this like nationalist kind of education, they can be very profound. So um and and also this like all the praise you have sung about China and the party, it's just very much like entrenched in you. So when it to it's interesting to say, but I think like you call it brainwashing or whatnot, but like it works. So it's not that easy to um at least I feel it wasn't that easy to jump out of it and try to look at it through different lenses and try to really engage in critical thinking, like okay, there might be something off here, and you know, and but like people do pick up signs here and there, I think. My my worry is just that, you know, with the lack of transparency to censorship, like if people don't have access to the information, and then you're gonna have more youth that's gonna adopt the patriotic uh um way of thinking.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's, I mean, since we've determined that we cannot ascertain what the impact of the Cultural Revolution is for the reasons we discussed, I think the next big important policy is certainly the one-child policy, because that's really going to, I think, shape a lot of the discussion around, at least partly, um, how the mating and dating market works. But if I recall, in 1979, the CCP introduced a one-child policy, meaning that couples could only have one child. From what I've investigated, and I've looked into this a fair bit in the past, this led over time. This was changed in 2015, but over that period of time, you were born within that period of only one child, which is why you don't have siblings. In general, there was a preference for male offspring infants because of the perception that they would be able to support the family in a better capacity. So this led to, well, how should we put it? Certain terminations of female fetuses and what have you. And so over time, this has created a skew in in population. I recently put up a video, but we're talking about several tens of millions of more uh, women than sorry, more men than there are women. And this, it seems to me, is a very important factor when considering the differences. There are many other differences, obviously, in the mating and dating game, the dance that men and women unfortunately have to go through in life, because women are already picky and choosy. And so if they if there are that many more men, and that those and the women that are there that many so much fewer rather, you're in a situation where it becomes even more difficult for, say, males to find partners, and arguably women, because they're so choosy, they're only going to be looking at the top. And I just wanted to sort of introduce the topic that way. But like, as I asked you before, I'll ask you again. The one-child policy. What do you? I mean, this is something that surely you could say a lot more about, because it's not really. I mean, I'm sure there's some things that are hidden and people don't openly talk about it, but it's something that you can see much more directly over the course of a long period of time, right? Over 30 years, in fact. How
I
this
mean,
might have
yeah.
skewed things, yeah.
I mean, like myself is a direct product of this policy
Yeah, yeah.
because I have no siblings. And so, from the policy point of view, I was also heard this theory about how calling a one-child policy is a simplified way of calling the population policy. Because actually, from like 1979 to like 2016, when they opened up to have like two child, the policy has like changed and it also enforced in different ways. For example, the ethnic minority groups can always have more babies, and like in the rural countryside, and if they have difficulties, they can also like get a permit and have more babies. And also, for example, like because I experienced the immigration or moving places to inland China to the Canton province, which is more the coastal area. And I started to notice a lot of people, my generation, they actually had like a lot more children, and sometimes not just two or three or even five or six. So they do have uh, brothers and sisters, like, just my classmates in the same class from my generation. So you can see that the one child policy or the population policy was not enforced very equally across China.
Mm,
And yeah, so there's a lot of difference around that. And and I think there's a book called like the Good Women of China, like talked about this as well. But the forced abortion or the women that got sterilized, they're true stories. um One film that got out, that was released a couple years ago, 2019, called So Long My Son. I would recommend it. It's from the sixth generation of Chinese director Wang Xiaoshuai, and that film depicts how, like during the under the one child policy, the woman got like forced abortion, and something happened. I'm not going to spoil it, but it's a interesting movie to watch if you want to learn more about the one child policy thing. So yeah, those cases do exist. And uh and just like observing from my experience or the people around me growing up, it's interesting because like girls were actually more discriminated in the sense that because families would prefer to have boys, and when you have a girl, I had a friend who told me how her grandma from the father's side just like despised her existence just because she was a girl. And like there are more instances like that. So some women, some girls, when they were growing up, they also tend to prove themselves because they would think that, oh, my family wanted a boy, but I'm a girl. Am I a disappointment? So I need to work harder so that I can prove my worth, prove myself worthy. And so that's some stories that I've heard. And there, the other side of story, which because of one child policy, you have only child, and then you have like grandparents, like four of them from both sides. So in some families, they are also the phenomenon of the kids being really spoiled, because that's the only grandchild that the grandparents can give their attention to. So they will just like satisfy every need of them. So you also hear about the stories how some single child, like only child, got really spoiled. So that also exists. mm, I think like I personally was quite lucky that I never experienced that kind of discrimination from my family. Not really. I might be slightly spoiled that happened. But mm, when it comes to like dating, yeah, this is quite timely in the sense that China just launched the latest population census, like recently, right? Last week or so.
last week.
Uh,
Okay. Wow, that's new.
Yeah, so what is it like? It might be even this week. Uh, and yeah, the latest census, because they do it every 10 years for the population census. So I think on Monday. So was that last Monday? So they had the latest statistic on how in 2020 there are 34.9 million male than female.
Hmm.
Mm, and for the age group between 20 and 40, uh, the gender ratio is 108.9 male for 100 female. So yes, there are some like more guys than women. But mm, what do you mean by like dating and mating?
Well, a little extra point. I think I've read this recently that they're now allowing people to have up to three. This is very recent.
Yeah, that's 31st of May, I believe.
Hmm.
They open it up for people to have 3 children. Yeah.
Well, that's very generous of them. Um, well, I think that so effectively, normally the way nature works, you know, I would say by intention, but it's just the way it works out, is you have a roughly 50-50 ratio. It's not perfectly 50-50, but usually the typically you'll have roughly equal rates of males born to females. But if you artificially interfere with that through government or social policy, then you get a skewing effect, which is what we sort of just discussed or described. And this skewing effect is going to have an effect on the mating and dating because, again, as I mentioned earlier, women are picky and choosy, right? That's what you guys are. So you're already picky and choosy. So, and then you have a very large pool of males. The vast majority of those males are going to be disqualified anyway because they're not at the top ideally. And so you end up in the situation where it's not good really for either sex, but for the females, there are very few of these males to go around, and for the males who have the larger numbers, very few of them are going to be able to find partners, wives, GFs, whatever, however you want to phrase it. And so the artificial intervention makes the mating and dating market more treacherous, more difficult to navigate, just on principle. But then you have all the very different cultural differences between the West and China. I mean, I sent you that song, no car, no house, right? Or at least that's the translation in English. You would know better than I about the frankness and the honesty with which a lot of Chinese women and I guess Chinese culture in general broadly addresses these sorts of issues, right? It's not in the West in general. We tend to do one thing and say something very different. So you might have a cousin who's extremely obese, right? I don't know. She weighs, I don't know, 180 kilos or something. I'm just making this up, obviously, but everyone knows it. But when you visit your aunt or your uncle in the West, this is a fictional scenario, but and maybe it wouldn't happen to this degree, but you would just say, "Oh, it's my cousin Lucy. Oh, you look lovely." Nobody believes that Lucy, who is 180 kilos, which is for Americans well over 400 pounds, um, or close to it rather. Uh, Nobody thinks that she's really lovely. So in general in the West, we like to pretend, we like to be nice, openly. But internally and I wouldn't say covertly, but beneath the surface, people follow the same general guidelines that all humans do when it comes to mating and dating, which is to say, people are focused on things, quote unquote, superficial things like appearance and weight and this sort of thing. But but if you were just listen to people, particularly women, they'll talk about it's mostly women. I Not exclusively, but being funny and having a nice personality, and they tend to obfuscate and obscure the underlying reality by saying that because yes, those things might be nominally important, but if you look at these things like a checklist, or a laundry list. You're going through the list from top to bottom. Those things won't be at the top. So my sense, and again, I've only been to China once in my life, and it was fairly briefly. But from the distance, my observations, having investigated this over the years, it does seem that Chinese people, and specifically women, are much more frank about this. I mean, again, this is embodied or personified in that sound, no car, no house. But this idea that if you're not if you're not of a certain status, we just don't want you. Now, that's increasing in the West. That's becoming more and more the case, I would argue, um, where women are just sort of saying, "Look, you you're not at my level. You're not earning enough, whatever it might be, or you're too short." But there's still what I would call a bunch of platitudes that are thrown about in the West, where they say, "Oh well, it's your personality, that's the problem." And this has kind of become this is over time morphed into a meme, right? You have so-called incel culture, right, where there's this idea that these guys who are very short, you know, say below 5'5", so for you, and I have to convert here, one, they're some guy who's 163, right? And people are telling him, well, your problem is you're just not funny enough, or you have a bad attitude, and not really understanding the link or the connection between that so-called bad attitude and being, say, 163 as a guy. That's if it's over, effectively. You're not going to ever find somebody if you're that short. Almost certainly not. And so in the West, essentially what I'm saying is we sugarcoat things. We've done this for a long time. We like to be polite. We like to pretend one thing on the outside, and then internally we think or do another thing. And in closed circles, you might say something quite different. But my sense in China, and you would be in a much better position to comment this as a female, a Chinese female, is that a Chinese woman would be much more frank in saying, look, you're missing this. You're not tall enough. You're not wealthy enough. You're this. You're that. You're unattractive. Whatever. And they wouldn't really sugarcoat it. And I think that my sense, again, I don't speak Chinese, so I can't really examine this on a first hand basis. But I do think that my impression, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that yeah, everyone in China knows the name of the game. Nobody is pretending. Nobody is telling white lies. It's a very sort of cutthroat dating and mating market, but at least it's honest. In contrast to the West, specifically places like the United States and Canada, North America, the Anglosphere most specifically, it there's a lot of BS going on. There are a lot of people saying one thing and doing another. And in China, you just don't have that phenomenon. I mean, it's just sort of if somebody is a quote unquote loser, they're just going to be told that. And this goes for just everything and based on my observations. And again, you can confirm or otherwise, but if a person's too fat, if they are seemingly dumb, if they're not performing well in school, in the West, so for example, in the West, if someone is not performing well in school, sure, they might be helped, they might be given tutors, whatever. But there's a sort of meme that I'll give you an example. Maybe they're not doing well in mathematics, right? And they really struggle. And so it's just because of the teacher, right? Which may be the case, but it's not always the case. Sometimes people are just not that very good, not particularly good at mathematics. And so in the West, we sort of tend to sugarcoat things, say, well, it's just because of the teacher, this or that. Every time there's somebody who's not performing well, there's some external excuse given rather than sort of being descriptive and say, well, maybe this person just isn't very good at mathematics. Or getting back to the mating dating example, if you're that short as a guy, people are not going to come clean and say, look, you're just never gonna at this unless you maybe find a girlfriend's even shorter, maybe, but they're not going to accept that you're that short anyway. So you see what I'm really getting at? That in the West we obfuscate, we tell white lies, we tend to be polite, but in China it's much more cutthroat in the sense that the cards are laid out on the table, so to speak, as we say, and so it's just this is the way it is. So please tell us, enlighten us,
Like,
Jojo.
no, but like, I've watched a YouTube video calling the hot money matrix, hot sexy matrix. You probably know which one I'm referring to, right? Like when you look at women and how hot they are, a hot crazy matrix.
Hmm.
Have you watched that one? You know which one I'm talking
Yeah,
about.
yeah. It's old,
Yeah.
but yeah, I've seen that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is old, but like they also did one for guys, right? The money and cute matrix, something like that.
Hmm.
And when I looked at it, it looks pretty true to me. So I I don't know, like it just feels quite universal to that extent. But yeah, when you talk about intervention in the populations, um I interestingly, when I was growing up, when I think about, one child policy or whenever people question me, is like, oh, what do you think about one child policy? I tend to think personally that I'm a sacrifice, in a sense that how China made its policy so that we don't have an overpopulation or like a severe overpopulation crisis in the world. So I tend to think it was like a good deed. And when it comes to the men and women ratio, it is true and it is quite skewed as of now. And there's going to cause a lot of social problems. And the Chinese state is also thinking about how to deal with the social problems, even taking care of this marriageable single men and the other population problems that comes with or just like lower birth rate and aging population, all of these problems. But um I think it's like um not too hard to imagine that we could have a population problem. Even when I was looking at a movie, it's called like What Happened to Monday. There was also picturing like the overpopulation problem. And in terms of men and women, I think what you talk about, like women being truthful or not, or mm, just the truth, the choices is made, you know, both by men and women. And I do agree that in China, I think, yeah, people are more blunt about it. And also because they see marriage as a social contract, which it is what it is. So there's no much of the fairy tale of a love story or whatnot. Because I think this is also on the backdrop that in China it is illegal to have a kid without a wedlock. So
It's illegal to have a child out of wedlock. Interesting.
because
What is the penalty? What is the punishment for that?
uh I think you need to pay fines, or it's just in general very complicated.
Hmm.
It is because that's the thing. That's the what I believe. Population policy exists in all the countries, but they exist in different forms, right?
Hmm.
Like if you building your tax code, if a family could have a tax break, that's the societal's value of gearing you towards uh what do you call them, core family kind of build
Values.
up.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also like for example in like Scandinavian countries, and sometimes they like I'm aware like Sweden, they also give single lady like state funded uh um what do you call this, like artificial insemination, like they can
Hmm.
have a baby just on their own, right? So those are the policies that you can have to uh is manipulate the right word? Yeah, like
Sure.
to manipulate the composition of families and societies and the population. In China's case, probably they're just being more explicit. Yeah, now we have single one child policy, and now we can have two. So and now we can have three. But I think because China has a lot of like population, 1.4 billion, and it's very competitive. And when it comes to getting married, to have kids, like people see it for the essence of it. Like they don't have much of mm, I think maybe some people do have an illusion of what it could be, but more people see it as a very direct a social contract, the marriage. And the way they describe in Chinese language is also very telling because they always say uh, marriage market. That's the way they frame it all the time. So why is it marriage market? Because there is demand and supply, and if there's like it goes with a market logic, so things will have a value attached to them when you are for the social norms more, beautiful, wealthy or whatnot. You are of a higher value. You're in higher demand in this market. So that is just how it works. This is very pragmatic kind of thinking, and it's also generated quite some interesting social phenomenons. That's true. For example, we have this something called mother-in-law economy. So a guy, because they will, as a husband, as of the family, they will have the responsibility of providing some basic stuff. So the mother-in-law, as in the women's mom, will be more demanding, right? Oh, you're gonna support my daughter, so we would like you to have a house, have a car, have a stable job, blah blah blah. So that happened, and then you also have this like single men in the rural areas that they feel like less competitive domestically, and there's this business growing, like they will go overseas to buy wives. That also happened in the uh or maybe buy wives is a
Find
really bad term.
wives. Yeah,
Yeah, like
yeah,
matchmaking,
yeah.
but like you know what I mean. Like so like in Cambodia, Vietnam, and Pakistan, it is also true. Like they will marry
Mm,
the the ladies there will like try to learn like Chinese and go to marry someone probably in China, like, not even tier four city, maybe in rural areas. So that also happened. Um, it's just mm, marriage, if you see in Chinese context, yeah, as I said, it's illegal to have a kid without a wedlock. So it has a really basic function of if you want to have a kid, you got to get married. So it's as simple as that. And the family as a unit has the responsibility of raising the kid. And also because like Chinese society doesn't really have a good social welfare, um, the social net for the elderly care.
mm,
So in Chinese society, it's very collective. So the family also has the responsibility of taking care of the elderly.
mhm,
Those are the basic functions of a unit of a family. In under this kind of context, yes, Chinese people see marriage more for its functionality. Being able to provide to the next generation, being able to provide for the previous generation, and how you two can, the men and women, if they can coexist. So if you take away the the human attraction factor out of this, yeah, it becomes quite simple in a way, like whether we can coexist, if we can get along, uh, like some basics, like how much is your income, your um,
mm.
educational level. So yeah, people can talk about it more frankly and
Yeah,
just see marriage as what it is,
I
as a
think
social contract.
the one of the primary differences is where we start going to culture and history is that the West has a relatively long tradition of romanticism. I mean, in fact, there's a literary cultural period, a historical period called that, just that. But also going as far back as the Middle Ages in Europe, where people would frequently, uh, at least in literary form, talk about courtly love, chivalric love, romantic love, and over the ages, this has trickled down for quite some time. And this, of course, in the West at least, coexisted in a form of tension between the pragmatic aspects of marriage, the social contract, which you mentioned, which I strongly agree with, and the more romanticized, idealized form of it. And in this modern incarnation, I think primarily because of different, as you just pointed out, different social governmental systems. I mean, safety nets of this sort of thing. Um, people, this has skewed things further to the point where maybe not in 2020. It's the 20s or 20s analysis is a bit difficult because we're still early into it. But this idea of love, certainly when I was growing up, throughout the latter part of the 20th century and in the early 21st century, romantic love was always cited as an important thing, and this led to, I think, lots of distortions in the mating market as well because people, women primarily, to be honest, developed again a skewed perception of what marriage is. They thought marriage was a romantic adventure, something fun or enjoyable, something that is supposed to elevate your soul or whatever, rather than the sort of economic social contract that it always has been. True, it existed in a kind of tension with this more romanticized ideal, but nonetheless, that had been the perception for quite some time. And that never took away the need or the necessity or even the desire on the part of women for quote unquote capable partners, wealthy, attractive, status oriented men. But that at the same time, a lot of these men were not offering the sort of wishy washy romantic stuff that women wanted. I think in some ways, the Chinese approach is just much more grounded in reality and much more pragmatic. It's just more practical. I think a lot of because I mentioned earlier this sort of game of obfuscation we play in the West, where people pretend a lot. They like to tell white lies. They cover things up. They say one thing, do another thing. It's not very useful because what happens and what has particularly happened in the online culture and the online environment is the lies and the deception and the fairy tales that we've told each other for decades have been decoded. They've essentially been torn down. Nobody and torn apart. Very few people actually believe these days. Maybe it's just because the circles are running. But when women talk about say romantic love, right? I mean, people in the West now know if they're online for the most part, know what the deal is when it comes to mating and dating, even if the public discourse doesn't necessarily reflect that. But the real question I often ask myself with respect to the West, and as it contrasts with China, is what would Western culture in general have to lose if it were more frank about this and any number of issues, but specifically this issue? Would something implode? Would it just blow up in our faces if people were just up? Because everyone knows. I mean, women know that men are very visually oriented. Women know that they need to be as hot as possible, ideally, right? Men kind of know they should be earning money and kind of know they should be looking good. It's I don't think a lot of harm would come from because de facto in the reality we live in and inhabit, it's happening anyway. All the sort of inclusion exclusion based on these particular criteria, all that's happening regardless. And so as a consequence, I don't really think that it would be the end of the world. Uh, and China, in this sense, at least, is fortunate not to have this tradition going back centuries of sort of romanticized love and what have you. Um, and again, it existed in a sort of it coexisted in tension with other things, the pragmatic aspects of the social contract. But frankly, I think um, I think that the Chinese way of going about this is easier. Now, there are other things about China where, you know, nobody in the West, I mean, you wouldn't, I mean, there's this term leftover women, uh, and I'd be happy to hear more about it. You couldn't, I think that's what, for women over 25 or something, You could never use that term in the West, ever, for obvious reasons. I don't need to elaborate as to why. You couldn't say women above 25 that aren't married are left over. If you said that publicly, you'd lose your job, you'd be uh, socially shunned, etc. So maybe we could talk a little bit about that distinction as well. I mean, what is a leftover woman? What does it mean? What's the age range? And how does it contrast with the West? Maybe you can tell us about that.
Yeah, yeah, I am a leftover woman, like by definition, I
Well,
guess.
I,
Yeah, it's
I
like women over the age of 25 left unmarried. In China, they
mm,
are some of them have been coined like leftover women. That's
mhm.
true. Yeah. But to talk about a little bit of the romanticized love of marriage, that I would say it does exist in China, and it did exist. And the idea, the fairy tale of love, was quite popular. I think, like in the earliest 20th century, after the what do you call it? New cultural. There was a movement, and it was around that there was some literature coming out, also romanticize like relationship and stuff. But again, this is echoes to what we talked about the Cultural Revolution, because around that time marriage become very political. So that largely also transformed society. So interestingly, if you look at since the People's Republic of China, when they had the marriage law, it had been revised 3 times, I think. So like yeah, like in 1950, the marriage law was stating, we cannot, like, it has to be matrimony. Is that a word? Like one
Mhm.
one one woman, one man. Yeah, that's because like previously Chinese guys can have like more than one wife. And actually it was until 1970 Hong Kong adopted that. Like before that, Hong Kong guys, they could have more than one wife. Like even nowadays, there's I think a legislator in Macau. She was the fourth wife of the gaming tycoon Stanley Ho, and everybody, that was just the way it was. So yeah, that exists. So and around 1980, so that's after the Cultural Revolution, one clause that's been added to the marriage law to talk about how the marriage, even like when you get if you want to separate or not, it has to be based on um, emotion, the connection, yeah, the relationship between the two people. That's trying to the introduction of this clause is trying to fix what happened during the Cultural Revolution, when people are forced being together or like forced to be separated because of politics. Some of them are not from the same uh class, and they have to be separated, and a lot of problems over there. And like around 2001, there's another amendment to the marriage law where they fixed, saying that a married person shouldn't be living with other people. That was trying to fix after the open and reform in 1978, and China uh, was a developing economy. So there was like a lot of guys who got like very rich, and they were not satisfied with one wife in the household. They will just go out and have mistresses.
Mm.
And so in 2001, that was introduction of that clause to fix that problem. And also they introduced something about domestic violence. So it has like been evolving. And so again, Chinese people see marriage as the way it is. When you talk about romanticized love, sometimes it can be, you know, if you're just in a relationship talking about, love, stuff about love, it can be, mm, I wouldn't say less complicated, but yeah, to some extent, like there's a saying in China we say it's like, having a relationship is a matter of two persons, but having a marriage is a matter of two families.
Mm.
So that's pretty telling of how we view the matter of marriage. Because when you have a marriage, yeah, the next generation, the babies will be part of the equation. And then the previous generation, your mother-in-laws, father-in-laws, like how you're gonna who's gonna move in, like how do we like during Chinese New Year, which family do you go visit? All of these things will become at play. So it becomes much more complicated. And left woman, I'm not exactly sure when the term got like popularized, but as we already discussed, there are more marriageable guys surplus,
Hmm.
but still in China you will frame it as leftover women. So that is interesting, and I would say just because it exists doesn't mean it's like correct, but I'm like okay with it. But there are more reasons that can um behind this. So yes, women become more financially independent, and they have more choices, and they also start to see other ways of living. But I'm saying this still, the pressure for leftover women or men to get married is still pretty real. Yeah.
Well,
Mm.
how do you feel? I mean, you're as a self-described leftover woman. Do you
um,
feel pressure, or do you just is it are you do you exist beyond this paradigm? Do you at this stage? Do you feel just whatever? You're just you're doing your own thing.
Uh, if it's my personal case, to be very honest, I've always wanted to get married and have kids. Even when I was like 18, I thought about I'm gonna get married when I'm like 24 and then have kids when I'm 25. That was the plan, but it just never happened. So I don't object the idea of getting married and having kids, and just never happened. And um, I am lucky in the sense that Mm, yeah, I'm very privileged. I currently live in the West. Uh, but say my father will still, from time to time, send me a message. It's like, "How's it going? Do you have a boyfriend yet? When are you getting married? When am I going to have my grandkid?" You know, and I, to some extent, like I don't want to disappoint him as well, but it's just like, mm, not that I can I I don't even know. Like it's just cannot be. It's a problem that cannot be solved by like myself. So yeah. And I understand the pressure is also quite real for my peers back in China. And I do have a lot of friends who already got married and having kids, and those left unmarried, they do have a lot of pressure when they, especially during Chinese New Year, go back home, visit the families, and facing a lot of relatives. Mm, they will ask you, why are you not married yet? This kind of questions all the time. That's also true. So whether yourself you will scramble to this kind of pressure, it's really your choice. There maybe somebody don't care. Maybe yeah, maybe some would just like be nagged so much and they actually just go on matchmaking and blind dates and get married. It happens. Yeah, all sorts of stuff happened. And I would tend to think, or at least even from some friends that I have, Chinese friends that I've had that I met in the West, um, they would tell me that, which I will agree that the difference is that between the China and West, we, when living in the West, we think, mm, like, I tend to believe that the atmosphere can be more tolerant. Like, people have a more diversified kind of value system, and people are less judgmental. That is my mm, observation or perception of this matter. Maybe I'm wrong, but mm, yeah.
Well,
So,
that's without
yeah.
question. Again, it's not even it's beyond that. You in the West, you have arguably out of wedlock children, or that whole process procedure that's sort of glorified. You might have heard. I mean, we have a we have this phrase, single parents, and single parent in the West is it's a euphemism, right? It doesn't. the vast majority of the cases, it means single woman, single mother. It's I wouldn't say, yeah. Sometimes it's glorified. It's certainly when it's not if it's not glorified, it's certainly exonerated in the sense that it's not frowned upon. It's just another thing people do. Whatever.
Yeah.
It's a norm. It's basically a norm. In fact, I've talked about this in the mating and dating game. If you talk specifically to Americans, that's just a normal thing. If you're dating women, say 25 or upwards, then there's probably a 50-50 chance that you're going to be dating a single mother in that process. And that's just something
Mm.
if you want to engage in that sort of activity, you need to accept. It just sort of is what it is, right?
Mhm.
The question,
Yeah.
though, ultimately is whether or not that's good. Is it good at the individual level? Is it good socially? Is it good on the macroscopic level for society? I think the evidence suggests that it probably isn't the best thing. Now, I'm not saying necessarily we need to call every woman who is not unmarried, once she hits 26, a leftover woman. But really, we're kind of dealing with two extreme poles. On the one hand, you have the West, and specifically American society. I mean, that's kind of the epicenter of a lot of this, where, again, single parents or single mothers are glorified to a large degree. There's no problem with any sort of behavior. You're just sort of free to be you and me. You can do anything you want. And arguably, there are no real consequences, at least socially. You're not allowed to exercise or at least impose consequences, rather. And then, of course, you
Um,
have the extreme situation, arguably, in China. I think you could find some middle ground where it's acknowledged that the Western practices are not ideal, probably, for at least many, many people. Um, and and somewhere in between where, you don't actually actively punish women just for the sake of. I mean, you can do that, like China, if you want to even call it punishment. I'm not sure what the perfect solution to this is, if there is one. I don't think there's a solution in the West. I mean, one advantage the CCP has through its censorship is the sort of relative, I mean, I'm being relative here, absolute control it has over the media apparatus and just general social policy. I can't imagine a world in China, and I'm the opposite of an expert, but I can't imagine a China where single mothers and unmarried women at 35 become sort of glorified as a sort of as heroes, right? In fact, sometimes they're called heroes in the West, particularly in the United States. It's called the hardest job in the world, right? Which is, manifestly not.
Single mom.
Yes, single mothers
No,
working. Yeah, it wouldn't happen in
I
China.
don't. I
Yeah,
don't think so. In my, I mean, I recall reading some material about there was like a motion from the Jilin province where they were trying to open up for single mom to have kid. As in, like single women, you can just get a artificial insemination and have your own kid, but it never got past National People's Congress. I don't think it did. No. And I think it's just like quite realistic because biologically or like medically, women has this ultim ultimo age when you can, deliver the healthiest baby. That's like, to my knowledge, like between 21 and 30.
between eight.
So,
No, 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 between 18 and 25, actually. Yeah, it's more narrow than that.
all right, I'm getting educated here. Yeah. So like that's like a biological fact. And within Chinese context, right, if you cannot have a children without wedlock, you cannot, as a single mom, just ask for some sperm donor and get pregnant. So you need to get married to be able to reproduce.
Mm.
So that factors in all this very realistic thinking. And as I mentioned it already, like Chinese society is quite competitive with all that mm, amount of like population and with the huge, I would say, inequality between the urban and rural area, and even within one urban area, because we in China we have this like tier one, tier four, tier three, this kind of like classification of the different cities depends on their um economic development. It's not an official way of categorize them, but like people talk about it that way. So tier one cities are Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen, I believe. And even within these cities, like the resources can also be distributed very unevenly. Just within the city, they have different districts. For example, in Beijing, the most prominent example, you have one district called Haidian, which is where all the most prominent Chinese universities are located, such as Peking University or Tsinghua University. So in uh, yeah, this gets very complicated because like it's like to do with a lot of things. In China, we have this 户口 policy. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but it's like sort of like residency registration policy. So if you are registered as a resident in this particular area, particular city, or even particular district, that affects a lot about your life, where your medical insurance is located, where you are eligible, your kids will be eligible to go to school in this district. And, you know, if, for example, if you're not a Beijing resident, like you cannot get a license plate uh, that in Beijing city. And each city or region, they have their own rules, but it's very much linked to your day-to-day life in terms of housing, education, medical, so a lot of that stuff. And that's because the resources are very um, unevenly distributed.
Mm.
So so yeah, like I recall there was one time I went to I think it's called People's Park in some park in Beijing, and you could see there. I think it's quite famous now. Like even the Western media has reported about it. But the first time I saw it, the marriage, the literal marriage market or matchmaking market. How do you call this? Like matchmaking corner,
Mm.
where you can see this like worried uh, parents, they will have literally just like one play card that has maybe the picture of their sons or daughters and the basic information. Usually the age, the height, the education level, and if you have extra, like I have like houses, cars, or whatnot, they will be listed. And then the parents will go and try to match make their kids. And that was a yeah, this is a real thing that happened in China as well. And um and I guess I can share some like uh latest developments within Chinese society or some buzzwords to say. So I think there's a word called involution that got like super popular lately. Um, have you heard about that?
Can you repeat that? The rate of
It's called involution.
in
Involution. 内卷.
involution. Okay, no,
Yeah.
I'm not familiar now.
No, so lately there's this word called involution. Like in recent years, couple of years, it's got like super popular in China, and it's just a concept that is described this. I think the better translation. So the Chinese word is called 内卷. I think the better translation might be like rat race.
Mm.
So, but the direct translation is involution. So it's originally it's a social concept that's introduced by I think anthropologists to describe um, the I think overproduction in the agriculture development when they cannot increase in productivity, but they just uh, got into this kind of competition, but without any meaningful outcome. So now it's being used in Chinese society. Like people will talk about involution in all the aspects, like in education, in academia, in their job market, where people just uh, constantly trying to compete with each other in this rat race, but without seeing the end of it and without finding any meaning in it. So there's another famous thing in the work environment called 996, 996, which describes those people in tech industry in China, mainly in tech industry, I believe, that work from 9 to 9 and 6 days a week. So this kind of overwork culture, and then they have no escape. So this all the also they describe it as involution. And again, I think this has a lot to do with uneven distribution of resources, the inequality, and the competition within it, or and also like people failing to see other opportunities, the lack of diversification of values and whatnot. And this has also gone to the next generation. So another thing I found interesting is there's a word called uh, jiwa, which literally translate into, I guess, like chicken baby. So the word ji, they come from like chicken blood. Uh, chicken blood in Chinese, 鸡血, or 打鸡血, it also means like motivate people,
Mm,
because it's like excite people or motivate people. So jiwa means like motivate your kids, but it has uh jiwa. This term has been like being popularized to describe how the parents nowadays are super like devoted into the education of their kids, like to make their kids competitive. So they will, you know, try to give them the best resources, move cities, like to get them into the best schools, and to give them all this extra curriculum activities or tutoring and all that. And I personally think this is a result of again the competition, and people, you know, um, really fear to lose what they have had. So if you are a middle class Chinese family, when you have your next generation and you just like moved up a social ladder, so there is fear that maybe you want to make sure that your next generation can, if not go up, at least stay at where they are. So mm, this has resulted in this kind of competition in the next generation, and the competition is quite amazing. Like even from like kindergarten, even before that, they will have all these resources poured into the children. And so this is something called jiwa, chicken baby, I guess.
mm.
Yeah. And in response to that, there's another sort of movement that I would say in recent weeks has been quite popular in Chinese discourse. This buzzword called 平躺, which also means or 躺平, which means the lying down. So in response to this like involution competition, the chicken baby jiwa, and there's some Chinese young people just choose to, I'm not gonna play your game. Let me just lie down. So there's another thing that's been happening in China. So there's a lot of things that's happening, and yeah, I also find it quite interesting. But I
What
can
do you
understand.
what do
Mm.
you think is preferential though, overall, the developments in the West with respect to this, or the developments in China? I mean, if you had to choose, now you live in the West, sure, presumably by choice. That might be a reflection of your own personal preference, but
Mm.
it may not be. I mean, what do you think the pros of the West are and the cons are weighed against China and vice versa?
To be honest, because like this is something that I constantly reflect on, as I touched on earlier, how I'm trying to, think about to which extent do I identify as a Chinese person. And I am very, very grateful for what I have been through, negative or positive. I think that, construct like who I am today. And I have to say, whenever we talk about China, I'm not, um, I'm not trying to defend or anything, because I also want to engage in a very critical thinking and conversation about it and how to make things better. Like, um, in the sense that, so just let me rewind a little bit. So whenever we talk about China, I think first of all, China is huge. It's like the size of Europe, right? So like in West, when you talk about, you talk about German, Sweden, Estonia, they're all in Europe, but there's huge differences. It's the same. China is huge, like 1.4 billion people. You just cannot like really simplify them. Yeah, we do some generalizations, but it's still very complicated. And my problem with the Western discourse or a lot of the news reports, they really do like. Mm, you just cannot depict. or they don't even try to make a very nuanced point. So that's something that I do have a problem with. And another thing is like China changes, like it's changing rapidly, like so drastically. Even when I was born, maybe this might be revealing of my age, but yeah, like um I remember recalling seeing like the carriages like led by horses running in cities. And when I first arrived in Shenzhen, which is the prime example of China's open and reform policy being made economic special economic zone, that the city used to describe it right next to Hong Kong, but now it has its own name because it's the headquarters of Huawei, Xiaomi, Tencent, all these tech companies. And there was like like really you can see it develop and grow. It's so drastic. Like many years ago, it was just a small fisherman's village. When I arrived, there was like no subway, and now they have like freaking 13 lines. And every time, sometimes I used to go by like once a month and whatnot, and you can just see like a new building just boom, suddenly just popped out. It's like so crazy. And every time I go back, you see the e-commerce developing, and once like, oh, China's become cashless now, like I take a taxi ride and they don't stop receiving cash. It's like, oh, just scan my QR code and pay me through Alipay or WeChat. And it's really visible and you can feel the change is just so drastic. uh and so like I've read an article before. It was an expat, I think it was an American couple who said they made a choice of making their kids grow up in China. And the reason they gave is that when people are growing up in this kind of very developing, fast developing place, and the general atmosphere around them are quite positive, and they want their kid to be immersed in that kind of feeling, which I can understand. And like I myself, I do find I am a beneficiary of this as well. But there are things that truly worries me. And I have to say again, China's huge, China is changing rapidly, and the change is something I do reflect as well. Because when I was growing up, we have this concept of globalization. To some extent, I think I've been sold this wrong dream almost, because I also had I guess now I can call it an illusion of how China is going to open up, how we're going to be more integrated into the world, and how, things will be more democratic, will be more mm, free. But in recent years, more and more signs just show that this is not the direction we're heading to. No, like the firewall,
Yeah,
the filter, the
if I
VPN.
may, if I may, because I think it's
Mhm,
a
mhm.
important point. So this was way back in the early 90s. There was a Japanese American guy named Francis Fukuyama who talked about the end of
Yep,
history and, all right,
yep.
this sort of this direction that in the future every industrialized, advanced, globalized society will simply be accelerating towards democracy. But I think modern China really shows that that's not the case. That you can have effectively a dictatorship with some modern aspects, and all these other, and basically a mixed dictatorship, you could say, with a mixed market economy, but there's still differences in it. And you can have these things and still exist in the 21st century. You can have these things in 2021. And since then, he's tried to revise his opinions, and I think he's published a few essays. I wouldn't say backtracking, but saying, "Well, that's not exactly what I meant, and I meant this." And but we can actually see that, yeah, you can have a society like China, which is pretty advanced and moving forward without any of the trappings of quote unquote Western democracy. And in my own estimation, I'd have to say that the West and the Western culture is very much in decline. The obsession it has with the modern form of social justice, so beyond sort of basic concepts of fairness, this sort of obsession really that people have developed, um, to the point where you have new vocabulary for these things, micro transgression, or microaggression or whatever these. I lose track. I think, I'm not saying that China and the West are necessarily in competition, but at the end of the day, countries, states exist in a state of, well, relative competition, right? They have interests. The general trend that the West has gone down and the path it's decided to tread has not been, I think, really beneficial. Um, I think the West had achieved effectively basic principles of fairness and what have you to a very healthy degree, and that was seen as insufficient. And now people have become obsessed with every little misdemeanor and so-called, not even a crime, offense that might be caused, and we're losing track of the big picture in the process. And sometimes I wonder, I bet you, even as people argue the silly things that people argue in the West, and I don't need to say it out loud. I'd get in trouble for probably doing so on YouTube, but I think everyone knows exactly what I'm talking about. That people sitting at a committee meeting in the CCP are probably laughing their asses off. They must think it's hilarious and just funny to see the way the West is shooting itself in the foot repeatedly, again and again, on every front, the mating markets, culturally, socially, whatever. It's not to say I think China is perfect or it's going to be a grand success story, but in the last few decades, especially in the last 2 decades, the West has decided to scrap a lot of the things that made it good and made it efficient. And yeah, it's
And,
baffling. Sometimes I think about it
mm,
as someone who's older, and I can't
so
believe how we got here. But
so you mentioned Fukuyama. Yeah, like around that time, he sort of labeled China as a responsive authoritarianism.
hmm
And I think about that term. I think there's some truth to it. But when he drew the conclusion, he sort of laid down the prerequisite, which is meritocracy, a disciplined party hierarchy, respect for education, and he said a sense among the rulers that they have a certain responsibility to act in the public interest.
hmm
And yeah, as you said, he has like come back and revised his sayings. But my concern is that with within the Chinese like governing regimes, if you don't have the transparency, the lack of transparency, also resulting in a lack of trust. So there is like this privilege, the corruptions that's going on. So how can you guarantee that they're thinking the public interest? So
hmm
um and you are absolutely right. I think in the sense that what the West has got wrong about China, and one of the big thing it is uh they think authoritarian political system cannot be legitimate, and a lot of what is going on in China has been challenging what the West perceive that has to be true. The property rights, the freedom of expression, and all these liberal democratic values has to hold truth for a place to develop economically. But China's development really challenging. It's really challenging this, and mm, I like basically our conversation being framed under the like what are the differences between China and West, and I would say there are also commonalities because the when it comes down to people's basic needs or what we want as human beings, it's not that different. We're all people. So how the systems can be built, um towards what is better is like requires like all of us reflection. And again, I also think that, you know, um this is my observation, but I think a lot of times we got very caught up in the narratives and discourse in the politics. But like politics is, mm, it's also about competency, and this is what China holds as its leverage as of now. Because if the economy is developing, you know, people will buy their story
Yeah.
domestically or externally. People will think, will look at it, and also, for example, you mentioned that Chinese, the CCP Politburo members might be laughing. I wouldn't say so.
Mm,
From what I have learned, like China a lot of times look to the West and even look up to the West. Um, but it is the responsive authoritarianism. Why I found truth in it is because it is responsive. It is reactionary. So China, as it is what it is right now, you know, the economic policies or how they don't want to let go of certain powers. They look at the examples that in the West, you know, in 2008, the financial crisis, where United States have failed so spectacularly. So, you know, China learn the CCP will learn from that kind of lessons,
mm.
so that they will, you know, not let go of the centralization of the power. And also you know, like even the politics, the democratic run, like what happened on this January in Capitol Hill or whatnot,
All right.
and you look at that, yeah, like me just as an, you know, normal human being, like observing what it is, I have to say, you know, the so-called democratic values is not setting a really good example.
Well, I mean,
Um,
this is the point I wanted to raise. You brought up this sort of sense of patriotism and nationalism. I mean, I'm not gonna pass judgment one way or another. At the end of the day, I don't feel particularly patriotic or nationalist. I don't really feel like I belong anywhere. But the fact of the matter is that with increasing numbers of young, smart Chinese people feeling a sense of cohesion and nationalism versus the absolute mess, and I do mean the rotting mess that, say, the United States is, where everyone is looking to, at least metaphorically, bite the other person's head off. The political divisions, it's just massive. The United States is quite literally falling apart at the seams. I It seems obvious at this stage that, at least in the American context, so-called liberal democracy is not working terribly well, all things considered. And rather than making that observation and trying to think about solutions, it seems that, in particular, the United States, although some parts of Europe are doing this too, wishes to continue down the path it's decided to go on and just allow things
um,
to further spiral out of control. And yeah, we have. I'm not saying we should have a Chinese style system at all, but if people are really concerned about, being sort of globally competitive and just general functionality, I don't think the current trajectory is
um,
good. Go on.
I agree with you, and also, yeah, um, like when the incident came out, and sometimes I look at, you know, people tweeting and whatnot, they would say this does not represent America, and I was just like, okay, so what does? You know, like either people are not seeing the reality or they are in like huge denial of seeing the reality, and that's something really baffles me. And mm, yeah, I found it a bit problematic. Like again, I don't want to pass on any judgment here, and I'm certainly not defending what CCP is doing, and I'm not like promoting it. But what I do think we like at least what I can do is just, you know, see it and try to tease out, you know, what is going on here? What is the uh um For example, like when it comes down to China, like I get a feeling that a lot of Westerners, when they talk about China, they really just instinctively just be very defensive. This happens among the general public and even some policymakers or even the academic. Like whenever they talk about China, it's something just wrong there.
Mm,
I get a feeling that they hold on to their moral truth, that there's just the kind of mindset that whatever the CCP is doing is kind of evil. And to be honest, I don't think that's very conducive to whatever they were trying to achieve.
mm,
You know, if you are being pragmatic, if you are really thinking about your own interest, in China we actually have this. I've looked at a opinion piece where they were talking about what shielded China for its development. To some extent, it is this kind of um, underestimation of the China's ability. Whenever they think, an authoritarian regime cannot have the competitiveness, cannot have the competency to grow its uh, economy, it somehow, shielded China so it could develop, this tech industry. The sanctions on the, making chips or this IP production might come too late, precisely because uh, these policymakers and people in the West talking about China, they take such a instantly negative view towards it. So I personally I still want to collaborate. I still want to, I have this illusion or dream or hope or whatnot. Just, can we not frame it as, confrontational or even frame it as conflict? Can we still coexist? Mm, but yeah, this is something I might need to revise on my
well,
own.
I mean, I can't. I really would be remiss. I mean, in this discussion, the yeah, I'm talking about the CCP. Look, the other thing that China has a massive advantage over with respect to the West is just, well, I have to discuss something that we've all been dealing with now for about going on 2 years, close to it, a year and a half maybe. Everyone knows what I'm talking about, the pestilence, however you want to refer to it. Now, the lack of cooperation on the part of the CCP and its desire to save face and the irresponsibility in the initial stages with respect to other countries in the world was quite apparent. But because the West is so economically dependent on China, there's been no real criticism, no real um, censor. There's been nothing of the sort. So China really has most of the advantages going forward. You have functional authoritarianism. You have most Western countries in effectively in the trade economic pocket of China of cheap goods, and so China could get away with almost anything. If if the pestilence had emerged from some other country, like Iran, for example, or I don't know, take your pick, any sort of much less salient country, much less relevant country globally, you better believe there would have been some severe penalties. But yeah, I think China is in through the reasons you cited, but also the fact that the West is completely dependent on China economically for cheap goods, and it doesn't want to live without it. And maybe that's a I don't think it's a conscious decision, but I think if you were to poll people, that they probably would say, yeah, they don't want to live without it, and they're willing to pay the price. But there's another element here where really the fact that there cannot be a proper investigation of what happened with respect to the you know what is not surprising, but it's another point to add in the bucket list of advantages that China has over quote unquote liberal democracies. And yeah, I'm certainly not optimistic about anything because I'm just not optimistic, period. But I'm not optimistic about specifically the future. And I can assure you that if we're still alive in 5 to 10 years and whatever we see now in the West in particular, it will be even more insane. It will be even more accelerated. There'll be, I mean, I don't think we've reached the peak by any stretch. And I think that
Mm.
China with all its problems, it has problems, will continue to do relatively well, all things considered. Yeah,
Um, I I don't know. I'm just like as an individual observer here, right?
so
So,
am I.
yeah, so it's interesting. I don't have answers to any of that, but what I've observed, for example, there was a recently published book by this Luke Patty from the Oxford University. He talks about how China loses. That's the title of the book. So just like this global pushback against China's global ambitions, and they also talk about how you know it, the economic dependency is not as bad as it seems. Or there are like ways that you have to look at it. And for me, I just think that, for example, if you listen, if as an individual, if you hear all this anti-China sentiment and like China bashing narratives, you also have to question who's pushing, like who is pushing forward this kind of narrative, and what are their goals. And I agree with you. Like why aren't Western world taking a more stronger stance against China, right? So who's to blame here? Why don't you take a stronger stance in Taiwan and Xinjiang? And there's a lot of powers at play.
We all know why. I mean, come on, we don't need to.
Exactly. So it's like, yeah, and I but I do have to say, for example, uh, I don't think what's happening in China is as simplified as some of the Western media has portrayed it. Like, for example, even uh she to do with she, like there's a lot of this kind of narrative. It's as if there's a personality cult around it, how he himself has this like dictator image or whatnot.
Hmm.
That's something that I just don't think is true. The Communist Party of China has a much more complex and intricate network within it. It is never a single person's decision around
Hmm.
it. Yes, previously they did take what they call like a wolf warrior kind of foreign policy, which I consider very stupid. But just interestingly, this Monday, Xi Jinping actually within the Politburo, they had a meeting to talk about the basically the PR problem of disappear of China, and they said it was interesting that she mentioned that they want to put a global image of China that's what was the word that he used? Like lovable, respectful, and yeah. So like this is something that they've been thinking about. This as I find interesting. But even to do with like China's economic development within, even though now it is the second largest economy in the world, there's so many problems within. I honestly, I'm not very optimistic. Um, in on this front, as I mentioned, the gap between the urban and rural is huge. The distribution problems, and with the aging population and whatnot, China has a lot of problems within. I honestly don't think it is, as some people have mentioned how
But
it is
Jojo,
kind of.
I agree with
Mhm.
you, but ultimately, we agree that, say, both the West and China, right, their problems, but it's a question of, in their totality, right, if you were to add all the problems up, how many of the problems in their totality are going to lead to a competitive disadvantage for one side or the other? And I would argue the West is in a greater disadvantage at this stage. I'm not discounting what you're saying. I know about the huge rural urban difference. It's like night and day, right? In China. But uh, the other thing you have to add into the equation, in my humble opinion, is the population numbers. I mean, the urban centers make up are huge. So yeah, there are problems in the rural sector. But but I just don't think they're on par with just the overwhelming cultural decay and social decay in the West. I just think that yeah, there are these problems, but the other thing is, I mean, I hate to be this blunt, but when you have an autocratic system or a sort of authoritarian system, you don't need to care about the necessarily the farmers. I mean, you can, but it's not an absolute necessity. You don't have to pretend. I mean, you can say you do, but it's not terribly relevant. In the West, we go back to this idea of pretense and pretending and you have to pretend to care about everybody, even when it's not true. So if we were to add the problems up, in my humble opinion, I still think China is going to come out ahead in the long run for all sorts of reasons. Western economic dependency, efficient, responsive autocracy, whatever you want to call it. Um, and I think people in the West know this, but they're still permitting the West to slide down this tunnel of degradation. And I mean, that said, I'm not optimistic about anything. So I'm just saying if I were a betting man, which I'm not, and they said you only have two choices. You'd either bet on China or you'd bet on, say, the United States. I would bet on China.
That's interesting. And yeah, I guess if you're talking about the bigger picture and the effectiveness of ruling, sometimes I also do reflect. For example, even just the Great Firewall of China, right? There was like a British foreign correspondent who wrote a book on that, and when I asked, so what can we do about it, like the Great Firewall, and he just said, no, the conclusion is just it's very effective, and like link back to what I talked about the little pink and whatnot, it is kind true. It is working. So to give you an example of uh now it's already almost 2 years ago, 2019, when Hong Kong uh the incident happened, and I went back and visited China, and it was just the people around me, the way they talk about what happened in Hong Kong is just also like quite baffling. Like some of them very educated people, like upper class, upper middle class and whatnot. Some of them do believe that Hong Kong people took money to go on the streets. And when you question them, and they were like, "Yeah, this is what Xinhua news agency has said. This is what Hua Chunying, the China's like spokesperson, has said." So, and they don't have access to other information. So, what do you expect them to believe?
Yeah,
So, then s- sometimes I do feel a bit helpless, hopeless when I think about like how effective this mechanism has worked to this day, and this is my fear and my concern. But if you judge the efficiency or effectiveness of the ruling, yeah, some of the measures is quite effective, and considering, yeah, the amount of like data collections and whatnot, yeah, it's I don't, yeah, I don't have answers to that. I think it is concerning, and as an individual, as a Chinese person myself, yeah, this is something that I'm concerned with. The lack of freedom of speech, the kind of amount of surveillance, lack of privacy, the lack of transparency. Yeah.
sure,
Mm,
but again, you could I mean, I'm not arguing one thing or the other, but if you were, say, a member, a good standing in the CCP, you could say, look what freedom of speech has done to the United States. It's turned them into lunatics, running around, posting things online, attacking each other. This is the gift of freedom of speech. I mean, if that's you could spin it that way, and it's kind of true. Um,
I, yes, that's why I'm personally still going through this. intellectual battle of myself and trying to, think about these kind of issues. Like when people, yeah, as a Chinese person living in the West, you get questioned a lot. Oh, what about the social credit system? And I don't have a to go answer because I'm also thinking about it. And but
Sure.
no, I don't think like, living without the freedom of speech, it's no, like there are things that I agree with. As there's no freedom should be relative. Freedom should come with restrictions.
But let me present a paradigm here, Jojo. So, you know, I think so. In China, you have a formalized sort of government instituted social credit system, right? But in the West, particularly in the United States, you have it's informal. So the government doesn't in China. In the West, there's a social credit system too. If you have to kowtow to the ideology of whatever is in the fad of today. So in this case, it's far left-wing ideology, what we call wokeism. If you don't at least pay lip service to that publicly, you could lose your reputation, you could lose your job. If you go against it, you're definitely going to lose your job. So that's a kind of social credit system too. You will be excluded because you're not conforming to the cultural political ideology of the day. Now, it's not instituted by the government, but it doesn't really matter. When the culture at large is working in that way,
Yeah,
it doesn't make a difference.
I agree. I agree with that. A lot of the things just become, norms, and there are many forces and institutions that can push it into the norms. Either it is government or it is corporations. And the way I see it as of now, yes, like the in China, the state, the government, the party, it is very prominent in making all the things into norms, coding it into laws, and manipulating them into whatever way that's really aligned with their ideology, which they have done quite effectively. But um, yeah, I feel like in the West, I like, a lot of this driving forces are corporations, and I don't need to talk about the examples. I think
Yeah.
you would know. Yeah, so, but the interactions with I have had with some Western people is like I feel like sometimes they don't see it that way. Like they don't reflect back on how their society is being shaped, and like they kind of believe that they have this freedom and whatever that is. But and when it is when you talk about China, when it is a state and so pronounced, and then they can just very easily point finger and talk about what's wrong with that. And I just don't think it is in anyone's advantage to do so. Like if you don't see reality as what it is, you cannot make a good judgment and make good decision from that. That it's that simple. Yeah.
Nope, I agree with you. Well, I think this has been a great talk. I really appreciate you making the time, getting up early for my sake, since you're a champion sleeper and I'm not.
Thank you
Anyway,
for having me. Yeah, the
no,
pleasure
it's
is mine.
been
Thank you.
my pleasure. And yeah, to the audience, as usual, if I'm still alive, I will check you out later. Until the next time, may the gods watch over you. Take care. Bye bye.
If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.